Okay, with the St. Louis Blues winning their first Stanley Cup last week, I thought I'd have a look at the teams that are yet to win, that are currently in the NHL. There are 11 teams yet to win, plus the Seattle franchise, which will join in 2021. So let's have a look at the teams that are yet to win a Stanley Cup and how close they are to winning said Stanley Cup. The Arizona Coyotes, they were originally obviously the original Winnipeg Jets that had great success in the WHA. In 1996, the Jets were moved to what was then the Phoenix Coyotes down in Arizona. They have not had a lot of playoff success. They've had one conference final since 1996. They've come close to getting into playoffs this last season, narrowly missing out. I think with the Coyotes, my second team of choice, I would say they're getting closer to the playoffs, but the issue with them is they need that 40 goal scorer. They need a bit more scoring depth. There is scoring depth there, but they haven't got that out-and-out sniper in the team or a pair of them, and that's what's holding them back. Goaltending is solid. Defense, they've got some pretty solid defensemen, and they've got some pretty solid, two-way forwards. They need that sniper up front. They don't have that at the moment. That's what's holding them back, is a lack of a 40 goal scorer or two. Apart from that, they're a pretty solid side. They are getting there, but they haven't been in the playoffs for a while. Yeah, they haven't been in the playoffs for a while, and that's a problem, is when you have that lack of playoff experience. When the team finally gets there, it can be a bit daunting, and they can not do so well. We'll move on to the Buffalo Sabres. How many more years can this team miss the playoffs? They've got Darlene, they've got Eichel, Middlestat. Skinner's been signed on to a long-term contract. They have some star players. They somehow find a way not to get in the playoffs, and it's been going on for a long, long time. I don't know with the Buffalo Sabres if they can get in the playoffs this year, because they have all this talent and they're not getting over the line. Something's going wrong here, and they've been to the Stanley Cup final before. 99, obviously, the foot in the crease, if I have to remind Sabres fans of that. But they haven't been close to the playoffs for quite some time. And this is a concern, is that they've got these great players, and they're bringing players in. And they've got some talented youngsters, and they've got some solid NHL-level players. But they have no playoff experience as a team for a very long time. And if they were to get in the playoffs, again, would that lack of experience count against them? Or could they be the dark horses like Vegas were 2 seasons ago to get to a Stanley Cup final? They need to get some playoff action soon if they are to get a Stanley Cup, because much like the Coyotes, they've been out of the playoffs for a long time. One of the longest droughts of lack of playoff action that is going at the moment. It's not great. The Blue Jackets have finally won a playoff series. They're not close to winning a Stanley Cup yet, but they're getting there. When I say yet, not close yet, it's because they've only won the one playoff series. It took them so many attempts to win a playoff series, and yet a playoff game. They finally win a playoff series by sweeping the Tampa Bay Lightning, which no one expected, and then they fell apart in the second round. They could not get, past that second round. They're getting better. They've had, 3 consecutive seasons in the playoffs. They won their first playoff game. They won their first playoff round. They are getting better, but issues around goaltending with Bobrovsky. Panarin, is he going to go? So 2 of their key players could be on the way out this summer. Does that make them a better team if they don't have those egos in the dressing room? Does that weaken them? That's the question. But if they make the playoffs again, they are obviously growing in strength and building a base to take that next step. They have that playoff experience that the Sabres and the Coyotes don't have in recent years. The Panthers, they have only ever won playoff rounds in 1996. Every other time they've made the playoffs, they've gone out in the first round. They haven't been in the playoffs for a while. Another team with a lack of playoff experience in recent years, that is a problem. But they have Coach Quenneville behind Coach Q behind the bench for this coming season. I think they're going to be, rather than just narrowly missing out for the last couple of years, I think they're going to get in the playoffs. They could do something in the playoffs if they make the right trades and build the right roster. They have the forward attack. They have a pretty decent defence to a point. It's the goaltending. So they need to look at a few areas. But with Joel Quenneville behind the bench, I think they are a better team. He'll make the players better. But their lack of playoff experience as a group, with some players who play for the Panthers who've never been in the playoffs, again, much like the Sabres, much like Coyotes, they're missing that just getting into the playoffs for one and then winning a playoff game all round as the secondary. They should not be looking at the Stanley Cup just yet, but getting in the playoffs and doing something in the playoffs for the first time in 23 years. The Ottawa Senators, they are a mess at the moment off the ice. It's not good in Canada's capital with the Senators. Really not. They've lost Stone, Carlson, Hoffman. Some of their big name players have gone out the door because Eugene Melnyk wouldn't pay them. Pretty much. There are issues with the Senators. They are a very, very young team. There is playoff experience there, but it's what's happening off the ice and what's happening with coaching changes and trades and not keeping their core leadership together is a problem. But they have been to conference finals. They've done well in the playoffs before. There are players on that roster with playoff experience, but it's the off-the-ice issues that are harming the Senators. Will they remain in Ottawa for much longer? That's another question. Could they be moved? That's something to think about. They are in a bit of a mess. They are. But we'll see what happens with them. They might have one of those bizarre seasons because the NHL for the last 2 years has been so difficult to predict that not only the finishing who gets in the playoffs but who wins the Stanley Cup, with 2 seasons back to back with brand new winners of the Stanley Cup that have never won it before in the Blues and the Capitals. So anything's possible. Minnesota Wild, they missed the playoffs this past season and they've struggled to get out of the first round for several years. They look to be a declining squad. I hate to say it, they haven't done much in the playoffs when they get in. It's a shame because Minnesota is the state of hockey. A lot of American players come from the state of Minnesota that have played in the NHL and do play in the NHL, but the team itself hasn't been very successful in the postseason, and they've missed out this year, and last year they crashed out in the first round. There are issues with the team. Certain players who are key players are getting older. Goaltending is questionable at times. Devin Dubnyk does take a lot of criticism at times, although he has been pretty solid for the team for a while now. It's going to be interesting to see what the Wild do, but they've never won a Stanley Cup, of course, since they joined the league. The Nashville Predators obviously recently got to the Stanley Cup final a few years ago, but the last 2 seasons in the playoffs, they've come unstuck quite catastrophically. And there's questions about Pekka Rinne. There's questions about have they got too many talented players? Because regular season, they're brilliant. Regular season, the Nashville Predators are regularly top of the Central Division, and especially the last 2 years, they've topped the Central. They had the President's Trophy 2 seasons ago. The issue with Nashville is have they got too many cooks? They've got the most talented defence core of offensive defensemen you'll find, and they have depth scoring for all 4 lines. They are a very talented team, but is there too much talent on this team? Are there too many talented players vying for ice time and those egos clashing? That's a question. Because Pico Subban is a very big ego. He's a very big personality. Pekka Rinne, a lot of pressure on Pekka Rinne, even though he's one of the best goalkeepers Finland's ever produced. He's been found out in the playoffs in various playoff series that Nashville have lost. He has been found out. There's been weaknesses in his game that have been exploited by opposition teams. But Nashville have been to a Stanley Cup final in recent years. But I think they might have to make adjustments to that lineup. They might have to look at swapping a few things about. We shall see. They are still a playoff team. They are one of the best teams in the Central. They're a solid team. At times, they're a scary team to play against. But in the last 2 years in the playoffs, they have had meltdowns, basically. The San Jose Sharks are one of the most consistent playoff teams on this board. They regularly get in the playoffs. There's only a couple of seasons they've missed in the last, 15 years. They are regular playoff performers. They regularly get 100 points. If you look at their record, all time since they joined the league, the early years are a bit naff. They get good pretty quick. They've been a regular playoff team. They regularly make the playoffs Even if they miss it a couple of years here or there, they have a lengthy spell in the playoffs. The issue with San Jose is their leadership core is ageing. Joe Thornton, is he going to come back for yet another season? Erik Karlsson, will they extend his contract? Will he be a free agent? Joe Pavelski, how long can he be the guy leading the team? Those kind of questions. The Erik Karlsson one is interesting because they've obviously rejigged the defence core to get Erik Karlsson in. They've given up a lot to get Karlsson there. If he doesn't stay, that could be a risk. They traded a lot of pieces to the Senators, another team on this list. They are regular playoff performers. I don't see San Jose dropping out the playoffs. And as we've seen with the St. Louis Blues and the Vegas Golden Knights last year, you had that magical run, and St. Louis winning this year. Once you get momentum going, you can make it to a final like San Jose did a few years ago. So they're not a bad side, neither are Nashville, but they've been found out in the playoffs a few times. Nashville more recently than San Jose. San Jose's got a better playoff record than most of the teams on this board in the last 20 years. It's going to be interesting to see what they do with Karlsson. Will Joe Thornton come back? Pavelski, will they give him a bit more of a depth role, maybe? And mix it around a little bit. Pavelski is still a talented player, but he's also getting older. So it's interesting with the Sharks. They might be one of the likely ones to get a Stanley Cup soon. Some of the other teams I don't think are close enough yet. The Vancouver Canucks, they're in a rebuild phase. They've been to the Stanley Cup final 3 times, twice in my lifetime. The 2011 one is their most recent against Boston, which ended in Game 7 everyone knows about the Vancouver riots. I think at the moment, they're in a bit of a rebuild. If they do make the playoffs, because anything can happen, there's not a lot of playoff experience on that side. It's a very young team. It's a rebuilding team. If they were to make the playoffs, is it too soon for them? They've got a decent playoff history. They've got 3 Stanley Cup finals to the organisation's name. And there are maybe a few, backroom staff who remember 2011. There's that experience of when they do get to the playoffs, they can win games, but they flattered to deceive before as well. I think they're still rebuilding. I think if they were to make the playoffs this coming season, it's a season or two too soon. And I'll discuss, who I think, on this list is most likely. San Jose is still up there. Nashville, if they can make the adjustments, it's Kyle Turris on the way out, for example. They're still a playoff team. Vegas, they had a sophomore slump. Their first season was so good that it was very hard to replicate, but they have been to a Stanley Cup final, and they've won a lot of playoff games. So while they went out in the first round this year, that's not necessarily a bad thing. It's a learning experience because they won a lot of playoff games the season before last. They got to the Stanley Cup final in their first season. So they have that experience as well. So they've learned how to win, and they've also learned what it's like to lose as a team. So with that in mind, I think they're in a pretty solid position to be a regular playoff team for the next couple of years. And they have to make a couple of changes, a couple of additions, and this team could quite easily get back to the finals pretty soon. But they're only a 2-year-old franchise, so it's difficult to predict with Vegas what's going to happen in the next 5 years. At some point, there will be a rebuild phase for this team, or a retool, or a rejig. But they're such a young team, anything can happen. And Vegas is, they've had spells this past season where they didn't look very good, and then they turned it on and they looked pretty good. My team, the Winnipeg Jets, my favourite team. First round exit, I wasn't surprised with that, with how the second half of the season went. It was a bit of a meandering lack of direction. Some decisions have got to be made with lineup. I think, there's going to be some players coming in, some players going out. It's going to be interesting. But Vegas and Winnipeg obviously got to played each other in the conference final in 2018. They now have also learned how to get to the playoffs, because they've done it 3 years in 5, which is not bad. They got to the playoffs 2015, this past season, and obviously 2018 as well. So since the franchise has moved from Atlanta, where they only had 1 playoff appearance in how many years? That's how depressing it was down in Atlanta. They've had 3 in 5. So they are one of those teams that I think are going to be regular playoff contenders and regularly in the playoff hunt. Even if they narrowly miss out or they get in, I think the Jets going forward now have the playoff bug, and they want to fight for it. So Seattle obviously joining in 2021. I had to put them on the list. But let's have a look. So the Coyotes narrowly missing out in the playoffs this year. I think they are getting better. I think they could be on the edge of the playoff conversation again. I think in the West, there's a couple of teams that are in complete rebuild modes that were once like Anaheim and LA. They've fallen off a cliff. I think Arizona could possibly make a push for the playoffs this year. They're not close to winning the Stanley Cup at the moment, but they're getting better, and they are an underrated team. The issue with them, top end scoring. Buffalo Sabres, they keep missing the playoffs. So as an organisation, they've had one of the longest playoff droughts going. That's their weakness, is the lack of playoff experience throughout the team, and the lack of closeness to the playoffs as well. It's almost like they're just narrowly missing. They are missing by a fair bit, and they've got all these young, talented players, and are their best years being wasted? Buffalo, I don't think are close. Columbus, they've got the playoff bug now. It's 3 consecutive seasons. They're getting better each year. Some of the issues they've got to sort out, Bobrovsky and Panarin, are they going to be a better team without those two big egos in the dressing room? That's the question. Do you weaken yourself to actually make yourself better? I've heard that argument on a lot of forums, Twitter, other YouTube channels. Columbus, I don't think are going to win the Stanley Cup soon because they've got to get past the second round. They've got to win more than one playoff series in their entire franchise history for me to make that step. The lack of late round playoff experience, again, I think is holding them back, but they're getting there. The Panthers, they've got Joel Quenneville behind the bench. That will make them better. Much like Arizona, I think they're going to be closer to the playoffs, if not in it. If that means they're a wild card or a seeded third, that could be, I think, Florida's ceiling this season, but they have to actually do something in the playoffs. That's something they've not done since '96. Every time they get to the playoffs, they're out in the first round, so they have to actually have a playoff run. And there's question marks about the Panthers, should they stay in Florida because of the low attendances. Arizona, there's question about moving the team there, but this new owner that's coming in, I think that's off the table now. I think the new owner wants to keep them in Arizona. The Senators, all the off-ice stuff, they've got a very young roster. They've lost a lot of experienced players. They were terrible this last season. Coaching changes, the GM is under pressure. The owner's an arse. I'm being polite about Eugene Melnick. I don't like him. I've got a friend who's a Senators fan, and it's depressing listening to him sob. A grown man actually crying. I'm not joking. A grown man actually crying. With just frustration, because he's actually been fortunate enough. Unlike I haven't actually been to the US and Canada, but my friend's actually been fortunate enough to actually see the Senators, his team, play in real, for real, and he's been supporting the team since he was a kid when they were brought back into the league. He's had an affinity with this team his entire life as a fan. And the Senators not close to a Stanley Cup. But when they do get in the playoffs, they do stuff in the playoffs. They get to conference finals. They go on these playoff runs. They win playoff series. They have a few players still left over from their last playoff conference final run. But at the same time, what's happening off ice with the team, I think, is really holding them back. And the Senators' future with the arena issues and the ownership, I can't see the Senators getting close for a while. The Wild, I think, are on the verge of a rebuild. It depends on this coming season. If they get back in the playoffs, it just pushes it down the line a little bit. They haven't done anything in the playoffs for a while. And that's the issue with the Wild. They get to the playoffs and do nothing. They're a solid team, but I think they're aging. And they need to freshen up in Minnesota for them to get back to the playoffs and then do something. I can see them being competitive this coming season, but I can't see them in the next season or so going on a playoff run. I just cannot see it. Nashville, I think they had a bit of a down year this past season, but their playoff exit, I wasn't expecting that. Considering that in the last couple of years they've been to a Stanley Cup final, they've been to the second round, had to go to 7 games against the Jets. I did not see a first round exit for the Predators, but maybe that's a blessing in disguise. It says they have to fix something, they have to change it up a little bit in order to get back to the Stanley Cup final and have a shot at the title, because I think they've got a little bit too comfortable being the best team in the Central Division. I think that comfort is caught up with them. I think they need to make some changes. San Jose, question marks, Carlson, Thornton, Pavelski, they they are a solid playoff performing side, but they've only been to the one Stanley Cup final and they lost it. So it's one of them with San Jose. They are solid, very solid, very skilled, depth. They've got star talent, but are some of their key players getting older than, too old to compete in the NHL, because the NHL seems to be going the other way with younger, faster players, and San Jose, older, veteran players are in key positions. It's interesting. I think they will make the playoffs again. What is also interesting is how many the East-West divide on this list, because there's 11 teams, so one side's going to have more. But it's interesting looking at the East-West divide. Vancouver, I think they might be a wild card shot this coming season, but I don't think they're close to a Stanley Cup. I think there's too many pieces they've still got to bring in. They're building something there. It will take time, but they have had 3 runs to start. They've actually, on this board, they've had the most Stanley Cup final appearances out of all the teams on the board. So they've been closest in the past, twice in my lifetime, but I can see it being a couple of seasons before they're playoff ready. But they were at times this past season competitive, so they were better than the season before. It's a slow process in Vancouver. Whether the fan base is patient enough and the owners are patient enough is another thing. The Vegas Golden Knights, they're only 2 years old, so we haven't got enough sample size to go on, but they've been in the playoffs both seasons, a Stanley Cup final in the first season. I think last year, season just gone, will actually serve them well going forward as a learning curve, because they didn't have to go out in the first round. They weren't expected to get to the playoffs in the first year. The first year was unexpected what they did. The second year was what was expected in the second year anyway. So I think they've come back to reality a little bit. There needs to be some personnel changes and a few little combination changes in there with who's in what line, who's in what defensive partnership. But they have got one of the most solid rosters out of the teams on the board. Good coach in Gallant, solid roster. They've got some depth there. It's going to be interesting with Vegas over the next couple of years, but I think they're going to be a regular, much like San Jose, regular playoff performer. The Jets, I think, losing in the first round this season will also serve them in good stead as a learning lesson, because last year, again, they went on an unexpected run deep into the playoffs. They've now had 2 consecutive seasons in the playoffs. There's a few things they need to sort out. Truba, Myers, Line is a big question mark about his upstairs here, his focus and where his focus is at, and his fitness levels. But I think Winnipeg will probably be the closest team to a Stanley Cup with the roster they have. But let's have a quick look at what conference they're in. So we've got Western, East, 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 West, 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 West. The most teams without a Stanley Cup win are on the West Conference. There's only 4 teams from the Eastern Conference. The rest are from the West, and Seattle will be joining the Western Conference as well. So most of the success is in the East side, where most of the original 6 are based. In fact, all the original 6 are based on the Eastern side. So that explains a lot. But there we go. There's a quick look at the NHL franchises yet to win a Stanley Cup. Thank you very much for watching 23 minutes of me rambling, and I will have some more videos for you soon. I've got some videos on the NRL, the NBA, and of course the Women's World Cup. Some more games this evening. There's some final group games for some teams, and some teams trying to qualify for the next round. So I'm going to try and watch at least 2 games tonight, because I can't watch all 4. And I'll have some more videos for you very, very soon.